It is the 54th day of Israel-Hamas war, and since the onset of the ground invasion in northern Gaza, Israeli officials have asked citizens on the Gaza Strip to move southwards. But since then, Israel has continued to pound the southern enclave. So, is Israel preparing another ground offensive against Hamas in southern Gaza? And as the deadline for Israel-Hamas truce looms, where will the Israeli military target next? While speculations continue, in the latest, U.S. President Joe Biden and his administration have warned Israel that it must work to avoid significant further displacement of Palestinians. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who is currently in Brussels and set to pay his third wartime visit to West Asia, also said he would work to prolong a pause in the fighting in Gaza and asserted that the extension of a truce was also in Israel's interest.
Looking at the next couple of days, we'll be focused on doing what we can to extend the pause so that we can continue to get more hostages out and more humanitarian assistance in.
White House says that Israeli leadership is clear. They want to pursue its military objectives of getting back all the hostages and to finish Hamas.
Once the pauses are complete and the hostage exchanges are over, that they intend to continue their military operations against Hamas.
On the ground, in the ravaged Gaza, Palestinians are heading back to their homes. In the last 5 days, many of them have changed course and opted to go back to the devastated ruins.
اجينا على عذورنا هنا في الابراج، بطلع في الشباك يعني زي اللي ممسوح عن الخريطه. طب انا ايش ذنبي؟ طب انا وين اروح؟ طب انا وين اتوجه؟ ايش اسوي؟ ايش اعمل؟ اولادي عندي في رقبتي 6 انفار وانا السابع، عندي 8 انفار في بيتي، وين اروح؟ لا مخليين لا اكل ولا شرب ولا مخليين حيطه ولا مخليين اصلا شقه.
Since the war that began on October 7th, more than 1.7 million people in Gaza, or nearly 80% of the population, are now estimated to have been internally displaced. And this is according to the United Nations. Families have risked journeys through the blasted landscape through the designated route, which Israel said was a humanitarian corridor out of the war.
احنا جاي نعبي ميه حلوه. انتوا زي ما انتم شايفين الوضع كيف، ظل التهدئه ومن غير تهدئه برضه الناس ايش لا كهرب ولا ميه ولا اي حاجه من سبل الحياه. وشايفين العالم كيف يعني بالدور بعبوا ميه وبنضلنا لاخر الليل ومش ملاحقين. قد ما بنقدر مش ملاحقين، يعني الناس مشاكل، المشاكل والوضع الاقتصادي صعب جدا والله.
The Israeli military has made it clear that it will double down on what it calls Hamas targets in the besieged strip. Listen to what IDF spokesperson had to say.
It's a war of necessity to ensure an attack like this can never, ever happen again. Dismantling Hamas and rescuing our hostages demands troops on the ground. But Gaza is one of the world's most complex urban warfare arenas. Hamas operates out of schools, hospitals, mosques, and homes. No civilian building is spared by Hamas. We've operated without the element of surprise to give civilians time to leave the battle zone.
Ever since Hamas captured 240 people in the deadly rampage through southern Israel that triggered the Gaza war, Hamas militants have hoped to use the hostages as bargaining chips to secure freedom of Palestinians being held in Israeli jails. Mediators have had a hard task of convincing both parties to extend truces to enable more hostage releases. This far, Hamas has released 86 of the captives, mostly Israeli nationals. In exchange, Israel has released a total of 180 Palestinian prisoners, including women and children. Abi Own is the current spokesperson for hostages' families, and she's joining us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you for joining us on the show, Abi.
Thank you for having me.
Before I speak to you, let me tell our viewers about Abi. She is an American who's been living in Israel for 8 years. 5 of her family members, aged 12 to 80, were kidnapped by Hamas. Unfortunately, Abi lost 2 of her family members. First of all, our condolences to you. How are you coping up this far, Abi?
It feels like one long day of a nightmare so far. I don't know the day or the date. There's not much eating and sleeping. It's just fighting to make sure we bring home every single hostage.
Abi, how do you feel about the extension of the truce? And are there any signs of your family being part of the list of persons to be released?
We actually saw 2 of the children released 2 nights ago. So Erez and Sahar, aged 12 and 16, were released on Monday evening, and they went directly to the hospital, to their mother, and to their older brother and sister. And now we continue to fight for their father, Ofer, who is still there. And with regard to an extension, I am not a military or government official, but if a continued ceasefire brings home more hostages, then that would be my preference, because no innocent civilian deserves to be held in captivity.
Well said, Abi. Many are questioning the criteria of choosing what hostages will be released first. So far, it has been women, children, teenagers, and the elderly. What do you make of this criteria? Should it be there in the first place?
It's so hard when we, as families or as people who are trying to advocate on behalf of those being held, to say you should pay attention to a gender or an age or a nationality or something like that. I think the one thing we could agree on was that babies and children have no part in war, and that all of them needed to be released first, because it was just critical to get them out of that horror. Beyond that, I think that majority of us all feel like humans are human, and we want our mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and grandparents home. And every single release is critical for us. There's not one that's more important than the other.
Abi, before I continue, tell me a little bit more about your family who is being held in Gaza.
Right now it's Ofer. He is 53 years old. He is the father of 4 children, 2 of whom were held captive until 2 days ago. And he is a carpenter and a bike rider, and he lived on kibbutz near Oz, which is one of the kibbutzim on the Gaza border in the southern part. So 100 of the 450 people were either murdered or taken hostage on October 7th. He's a funny guy. He's the kind of guy that's going to make the whole room laugh. He smiles from his eyes, and we will fight day in and day out until he's home and until every single one of them are home.
Right. There have been protests by the families of hostages. There have been confrontation between the families of the hostages and the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. They have staged protests at his office. How would you gauge the Israeli war cabinet and the government of Israel approach and even response towards the release of hostages this far?
I don't think anyone is going to tell you that they did enough fast enough, because 50 days in is when we began seeing the first kind of big releases. That being said, Israel right now is facing 2 conflicting priorities. 1, the release of the hostages, and 2, the elimination of Hamas. And those don't necessarily align. And so you have your constituents, the citizens of Israel, pushing to bring our family members home. And you also have this massive threat that happened on October 7th that we need to respond to. And so that makes sense to me that the government didn't respond as quickly as they did. I don't agree with it. I don't think it's fair, but I understand the conflict.
Abi, finally, what's your message as the spokesperson for the families of the hostages to both Hamas and the international community?
On October 6th, there was a truce. On October 7th, Hamas broke that. Israel did not want to start or conduct a war. Our civilians were taken from their beds, from their homes, from a party. They were murdered. They were beheaded. They were tortured. And now they're being held against their will. And I want the world, whether it be a government or an aid organization, to think about if it was their parent. or their child or their sibling, and demand that an international aid organization be let in to see them. They need medical care. We need signs of life. And more than that, we need each and every one of them home.
WION, the spokesperson for the hostages' family, we hope for a swift and safe release of your family members and indeed all the hostages held by Hamas. Stay safe, and thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.